Bonjour, hello, and welcome. Thanks for being here with us this afternoon for this event, which is part of Black History Month 2022 at McGill. Mon nom est Daniel Bélan, je suis le directeur de l'Institut d'études canadiennes de McGill. I would like to begin by acknowledging that while we meet today on a virtual platform, McGill University is located on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. We do this to acknowledge the importance of the land on which we work, study, and live, and to acknowledge the complex web of relationships of which we are a part. Please note that today's lecture is being recorded and that simultaneous interpretation is available in French and English. An interpretation icon is at the bottom of your screen. You can click on it to choose your audio channel. Veuillez noter qu'on a la traduction simultanée aujourd'hui et que vous pouvez changer la langue, soit de passer de l'anglais au français ou du français à l'anglais. Au bas de votre écran, on a aujourd'hui une présentation et une discussion bilingue dans les deux langues officielles. There will be a moderated Q&A period following Emilie's talk, and you are welcome to submit questions at any time using the Q&A function. Fondé en 1994 grâce à un accord entre la famille Bronfman et l'Université McGill, l'Institut canadien de McGill a pour but de promouvoir une meilleure compréhension du Canada. L'Institut s'efforce de faire avancer la société canadienne, principalement en organisant des conversations sur des sujets qui sont importants pour les Canadiens et les Canadiennes, en formant des étudiants et des étudiantes et en les motivant à façonner le Canada de demain, et enfin en favorisant la recherche interdisciplinaire sur le pays. Today, we are pleased to welcome you to the Winter 2022 Mallory Lecture. I would like to take a minute to thank the Mallory family, whose support enriches the study of Canada at McGill and makes possible these annual lectures. J.R. Mallory was a professor of political science. He was born in 1916 in St. Andrews, New Brunswick, and was educated at New Brunswick, Dalhousie, and Edinburgh. His career took him to Saskatchewan, Toronto, Brandon, and McGill, where he served for 45 years and was the chair of the economics and political science departments for 10 years. After retiring in 1982, he was appointed professor emeritus and continued to teach for another 10 years. Professor Mallory passed away in 2003. The endowment for the J.R. Mallory Lecture in Canadian Studies was established in January 1995. The lecture has featured such renowned speakers as Bob Ray, Andrew Coyne, Alain Dubuc, Tom Kent, John Gomery, Chantal Hébert, Andrew Cohen, Noah Richler, Elizabeth May, and Tom Mulcair. Today, we are delighted to be joined by Emilie Nicolas for her lecture, When Injustice is Fully Bilingual. Emilie Nicolas est chroniqueuse au Devoir et à la Gazette. Elle est également consultante et conférencière sur les politiques publiques, l'équité, les droits humains, la coopération internationale et les questions de race et de genre. Elle collabore également aux émissions Power and Politics and Let's Go de la CBC, Power Play et Canada Land de CTV, et elle a été publiée dans plusieurs revues, magazines et journaux en français et en anglais. Plus récemment, elle a remporté le prix d'excellence 2020 de la Société de développement des périodiques culturels québécois, la SODEP, pour le meilleur essai dans un article publié dans le magazine Liberté. En tant que boursière Vanier et candidate au doctorat en anthropologie linguistique à l'Université de Toronto, Emilie a concentré ses recherches sur le rôle d'une langue partagée dans les liens entre le Québec et Haïti. Emilie est titulaire d'une maîtrise en littérature comparée de l'Université de Toronto. Elle a également enseigné le cours Black Lives Matter in the Media à l'Université St. Michael's College. I will now turn to Emilie, and I will be back for the Q&A session following your lecture. Bonjour Emilie, c'est à toi.
Bonjour Daniel. Merci
Bonjour.
beaucoup. Merci beaucoup d'être là aujourd'hui. Welcome, everyone. So as Danielle was saying, this is a bilingual lecture. I will be doing switching between languages, just in Trudeau style or not. So if you do need translation, please use it as I go along. So I'd like to start by sharing maybe a wartime story with you, a war story with you, taking you back to the spring of 2016. At the time, I was living in Montreal, and there were many different things happening at the same time. There was an investigation going on into the Val d'Or police being accused of some police officers being accused of sexual assault against Indigenous women in the region. Jean-Pierre Bonny was just killed by the police in Montreal North, and there had just been a rally to ask for justice for the death of Jean-Pierre Bonny. There had been increasingly more and more attacks on mosques all around Quebec. I'm talking about 2016, so just a year after, before the Quebec City mosque shooting, we could already see it coming. There were so many hate crimes being perpetrated on mosques everywhere in the province. And on the spring of 2016, we had just also had another round of debate on blackface on Radio-Canada, whether or not it was appropriate for the Bye-Bye to put on blackface in its show as part of a comical endeavor. So all of those things were going on at the same time, obviously touching a lot of different communities in Quebec. Black people, Indigenous people, Muslim folks, and many other racialized communities were being worried about the state of racism in Quebec, as they always are, but perhaps there was a momentum there that was even stronger. And so a group of us launched in that context a campaign aimed at the Quebec government to ask for a formal acknowledgement and an inquiry into the state of systemic racism in the province. Systemic racism, of course, being basically everything that leads to the creation and the reproduction of unequal distribution of resources, capital around line of race. We were giving examples of what that looked like concretely in health, in education, in justice, in employment, in prisons, of course, with police as well, with immigration policies. But at the same time, the discourse around systemic racism in Quebec back then was, it had been said before, we were not the first one to utter the word at all. But in terms of the institutional discourse, it was, I'd say, a lot less present than it was in the rest of Canada. It would be, actually, it was really hard to Google raciste systemic in French at the time. So the discourse was more in the state around terms like vivre ensemble, which is usually translated as living together. Whatever that means, I'm still not sure after years of working in those fields what vivre ensemble is supposed to mean. Of course, a really big term at the time was interculturalism, interculturalism, basically opposing that to multiculturalism, saying that basically it's about acknowledging that there's a French Canadian majority at the center of Quebec society, and then minorities have to basically have an interaction with that, but that there's no way to basically deny the centricity of the French Canadian majority in Quebec society. So those were the terms that a lot of people were working with in sociology and in even the Human Rights Commission, on the minister responsible, the department responsible for immigration, diversity, and inclusion. I think it was called at the time. And there was very little studies that were being published on those issues, apart from the piece about employment. So when we launched that campaign, at first we were being ignored because we were basically treated as ovnis or UFOs, I should say in English, in the Quebec landscape system. We were using a word that very few people in the media were able to comprehend, define easily. So the first reaction to the campaign that was launched in, I think it was May beginning of May of 2016, was being ignored. Then what happened was that there was some visibility, but only in English Montreal media, while most of the spokespersons were actually Francophones. So, but we were starting to get a little bit of traction, but only in English Montreal. And then it was really interesting because in the summer of 2016, as many of you can remember, there were a lot of Black Lives Matters protests happening in the US. And there was a need to have Black people who spoke French, who could speak to the Black Lives Matter movement in the US. And so myself and others were invited on television, on national television, Radio-Canada and other TVA and other channels to, comment, do live commentary on the protests that were happening in the US. And we basically used that as an opportunity to not do what we were told, which is talking about the US, and use that as an opportunity to talk about the same issues around police brutality and systemic racism happening right here in Quebec and Canada instead. So when we did that, the campaign started to gain a little bit of traction. Then it was about opposition parties reacting, other different political parties in the National Assembly reacting to that campaign by basically saying that, and I think it was Jean-François Lisé's invention, that we were attempting to put Québécois on trial. So mettre les Québécois en procès, faire le procès des Québécois was the catchphrase that was used at the time. And the other accusation as well was that basically systemic racism was an English concept. It was an American concept that we were importing into Quebec society, and that Quebec society is different. That, starting from Nouvelle France, Quebec society was always welcoming and peaceful and tolerant, and going back to this idea of vivre ensemble, living together, defining Quebec society, and that therefore we were importing foreign concepts, foreign ideas, trying to put either Anglo-Americans or just English ideas into the Quebec society discourse. And what happened, obviously, when that happened, is that several people outside of Quebec started paying attention to what's going on, and started to say, why is it so hard for Quebec to recognize systemic racism? What the hell is wrong with them? And with that, those tweets or those interventions were then picked up by people like Jean-François Lisée and others as a way to say, see, Quebecers are really on trial, and this systemic racism idea is really dangerous because it's going to be used as a way to attack Quebec. That put pressure on the Liberal government, provincial government at the time, to defend themselves from basically engaging in what is called Quebec bashing. And communications around that time for a campaign were everybody had to spend a lot of time discussing, or just taking the time to state that first of all, we're not, if you're using words like putting Quebecers on trial, you're excluding racialized Quebecers from your definition of Quebecers, and trying to counter that by basically saying that we're saying this as people who are as legitimate as having conversations around what's going on in our society than anyone else, and that kind of like positioning ourselves as Quebecers and saying that fighting systemic racism should be something that all Quebecers care about, took so much of the airtime, basically trying to defend ourselves around being pictured as evil English people invading Quebec with foreign ideas. That mental burden became very heavy, and it leaves very little space to actually talk about the issue, which is, as I was saying, in all the different fields in which systemic racism exists. in the end, the commission, the idea of having the Quebec government looked into it, as you probably know, it never happened. But at the same time, a lot of since in the last five, almost 6 years now, a lot of things have happened on the civil society side in terms of recognizing the notion and working with that as a framework to understand inequalities and systems of oppression in the province. But I wanted to start with this story because the lecture with this story, because there is that burden. There's just so many examples that could be used as well, and I will use other examples of that mental burden that is put on people who are trying to fight for racial justice or trying to find to name systems of oppression as they happen in Canadian society, which include Quebec, and that how much of efforts to name that, how much of mental energy to be able to name those issues are occupied by sensitivities around what is acceptable to be said as a racialized Quebecer. Where does that put you? Where does other Canadians come in? What can you say in French? What can you say in English? How that gets picked up or not? What kind of discourse gets ignored or has some reception? Which language? All of that takes so much space in organizing around social justice in Canada. And so that's one example, but there's a lot of other there's a lot of other moments as well where this mental burden comes up, and the result of that is a hyper consciousness around language, about language in terms of the words that you use, but language as well in terms of what language you're saying those words in. Is something that's very, I think, specific to people organizing in this country, and perhaps people organizing in places where language are heightened debate even more so as well. Bien sûr, une fois que j'ai dit ça, il faut aussi reconnaître que maintenant qu'on a parlé de la spécificité de l'enjeu à travers cet exemple-là, il y a aussi beaucoup de ce que j'ai nommé là qui est partagé par énormément d'autres sociétés occidentales. Les puissances occidentales, dans le fond de l'Atlantique, la Grande-Bretagne, la France, l'Espagne, le Portugal, les Pays-Bas, ont depuis 500 ans et plus entré dans une expérience d'expansion coloniale dans les Amériques, en Afrique, un peu partout sur plusieurs continents, qui s'est assise dans la dépossession des peuples de leur territoire et leur exploitation, pour accumuler plus de richesses, puis accroître leur pouvoir et compétitionner entre eux. Ça, bien sûr, finit par donner des nouveaux pays qui ont pris leur indépendance dans les Amériques même, par exemple. Le racisme ou le colonialisme, le patriarcat dans cette logique-là, c'est d'abord et avant tout un discours. Un discours qui sert, comme je le disais, à justifier l'accumulation inégale des capitaux, l'accumulation de la richesse dans les mains de certaines personnes, la déshumanisation d'autres personnes, l'exploitation du travail d'autres personnes. Donc, le racisme est un discours qui change aussi à travers le temps et avec l'espace. Tous ces régimes-là ont des façons particulières d'opérer. Ils ont des buts spécifiques, puis ils finissent par développer des discours aussi qui sont spécifiques, même si la logique, elle est commune dans un certain sens, du Canada jusqu'à l'Argentine dans les Amériques et entre les empires coloniaux européens de façon générale. Donc, même si les discours changent, partout en Occident, il est question de colonialisme, il est question de suprématie blanche. Partout en Occident, il y a aussi des mouvements de résistance au colonialisme et à la suprématie blanche. Et ces mouvements-là s'articulent contre les discours dominants qui, comme je le disais, changent d'un espace à l'autre. Et quand il y a des mouvements de résistance, il y a encore une autre couche, donc des discours réactionnaires qui sont aussi développés pour faire face à ces mouvements de résistance-là. Et donc, le besoin de nier la réalité du colonialisme, de la suprématie blanche systémique, il est partagé partout en Occident. Le réflexe soit du déni ou de légitimiser la hiérarchie, la façon dont les capitaux sont distribués dans une société, la façon dont le pouvoir est distribué dans une société, ça, c'est partagé. Ceci dit, dans chaque société, il y a des spécificités sur la façon dont ça s'articule. Si on prend, par exemple, le racisme anti-noir, en France, ben, le discours officiel qui a été développé, c'est beaucoup autour de l'idée du républicanisme. Donc, on va parler de la justice comme étant aveugle. On va empêcher de reconnaître la race officiellement dans la Constitution. On va empêcher de collecter des données sur les inégalités raciales. Bref, on va dire que ça n'existe pas et c'est pour ça que la France est supérieure essentiellement. Donc, c'est un discours qui justifie la supériorité civilisationnelle du centre de l'Empire, puis qui sert aussi à justifier les inégalités à l'intérieur de cet empire-là en disant, ben, s'il y a des gens qui ont moins de ressources, etc., mais c'est parce que justement, il y a encore ce travail à faire pour être civilisés, pour assimiler les idéaux républicains. Ils ne sont pas assez finalement évolués dans leur façon dans leurs valeurs démocratiques, etc. Donc, c'est pour ça qu'il y a plus de problèmes. Donc, il y a un discours spécifique qui est développé là, tout comme, par exemple, si je pense à l'Amérique latine, la façon de dealer avec le racisme anti-noir, c'est beaucoup avec l'idéologie, ce qu'on appelle du mestiçaje ou du métissage, où on s'est dit finalement, plutôt que de reconnaître qu'il y a des populations blanches, autochtones, noires, etc., on va dire tout le monde est mélangé. Donc, puisque tout le monde est mélangé, ben, on ne peut pas nécessairement nommer ça, on fait juste célébrer le fait que tout le monde est mélangé. Donc, c'est aussi la façon dont le déni opère dans plusieurs sociétés latinas. Je pense notamment au Mexique, en Colombie. C'est des discours qui sont très, très développés. Donc, c'est une autre façon d'arriver au même but, c'est-à-dire au déni du problème, puis à l'incapacité de travailler pour redresser les inégalités sociales, les inégalités raciales qui ont été héritées du colonialisme. Aux États-Unis, les gens vont connaître un peu plus la façon dont ça fonctionne. Il y a un exceptionnalisme américain. L'idée que la liberté, liberty, freedom, c'est la valeur fondatrice des États-Unis et que donc l'esclavage, oui, a existé, mais c'est un peu comme un accident de parcours, alors que les États-Unis ont toujours été à propos de la liberté. C'est à peu près ça le discours qu'on développe, que même c'est que les États-Unis non seulement c'est tellement à propos de la liberté, mais que c'est aussi un exportateur de liberté dans le monde. Donc, nécessairement, ce discours-là nationaliste vient aussi limiter la capacité de nommer même ou juste de raconter l'histoire des Noirs sans que ça soit perçu tout de suite comme une attaque au récit national. Et ça mène aussi à une reconnaissance, une historicisation du racisme, c'est-à-dire qu'on dit que ça existait jusqu'à ce que finalement Martin Luther King a gagné sa lutte. Puis maintenant, s'il y a des gens qui critiquent, ben, c'est des gens qui vivent dans le passé, alors que maintenant, les obstacles officiels à l'égalité raciale seraient déjà tombés. La preuve, Barack Obama a été le président, etc. Donc, il y a aussi un déni qui se passe par historicisation des enjeux de racisme. Puis ici, au Canada, on est dans un autre discours, mais comme je le disais, en fait, c'est comme si le besoin d'un système de se protéger vient avant le développement de l'argumentaire sur la façon dont on se protège. In Canada specifically, maybe I could start by saying that Canada might be one of the most successful marketing campaigns of all time. In terms of its image, it's managed to build a kind of univers de sens, a semiotic universe around the word and the flag that is supposed, for a lot of people, means a kind of like a benevolence, a good kind of like liberal country. The whole idea about niceness and politeness and all of that being put in a position with basically the aggressivity and the violence of the United States is one of the core, I guess, founding mythologies. I would use the term mythologies, yes, around Canada. But at the same time, that's, I'd say, mostly the English Canadian liberal narrative around what Canada means. In French, you also have actually this idea of benevolence and niceness, and yada yada, that everybody's tolerant, everybody's peaceful, but it applies to French Canadians, right? So basically, English Canadian nationalist discourses, there's a lot of them, but one of the major ones is about Canadian being nice, and then French Canadians say, well, French Canadians were really nice, but the British Empire was evil. And here is all the things that the British Empire did that was evil. And to which there's been an answer, I'd say, since the Quiet Revolution, since the development of the modern Quebec state. There's been a discourse as well being developed in English around the fact that Quebec doing that is a form of specific kind of ethno-nationalism that is especially sinful, which fails to see the ethno-nationalism inherited by basically British colonial institutions in all around the country, but points out the flaws of French-based Quebecois ethno-nationalism, and that creates a competition where basically everybody's arguing over who's actually nice, and those competitive settler colonial narratives are taking a lot of space in the public debates that we have. Now, I don't want to say, when I use the term discourse, when I say that those are narratives or those are mythologies, I don't want to convey the idea that there is not reasons that are past lived experience that have created those discourse, and there's not very real reason why those affects have been created. A part of French Canadian narratives that I was taught in school, and that I've been shared being immersed in French Canadian culture for many years of my life, is the idea that basically, as I was saying, British people are evil, but there's also the grand dérangement, so the deportation of the Acadians, the trauma of British Army invading the Quebec colony during the war that led to Quebec becoming a British territory. There's of course a long history of anti-Catholicism and anti-French sentiments around certain elites of Canada, like especially around the idea where the Orange Lodge was dominating Canadian politics, and so how all of that led to a level of discrimination in the state. And so people here tend to be quite versed in discussing those issues, because we're all taught about those in the Quebec school system. We're taught about, as well, I was taught about the ways in which Francophones who are living in Ontario, Manitoba, Alberta, were also subjected to laws that basically denied them for a period of time the right to have school in their own language. So that idea of Francophones being the underdog in Canadian society is a very strong one that is developed when you go through the Quebec school system. So when you have people like myself who then go on and talk about systemic racism as something that French Canadian institutions in the form of the government of Quebec and others are responsible for, it creates for a generation that has assimilated and integrated that discourse, that self-narrative or that collective narrative. It creates a kind of an existential crisis in terms of accepting that you're not the underdog, certainly not always in all situations, but you're also a dominant group. You're also a settler colonial group. That is part of the logic of settler colonial narrative. It takes a lot of unlearning and undoing your education to be able to hear that. And at the same time, there is that settler colonial pride and that Western pride that's always been there as well. that has showed up, especially I think during the mythologies around the Quiet Revolution, the idea of the grand rattrapage, the idea that we will be basically catching up with other wealthy, mostly white nations, and making sure that we would be as successful as them, and basically using those other countries, those other provinces as benchmark for the idea of what Quebec should be. And so therefore necessarily integrating that idea of white supremacy and Western supremacy as well. And so that creates a psyche that is very, that is full of contradiction, and that is very hard to deal with when you're trying to deal with education around systemic racism, around white supremacy, around colonialism, when you have in front of you a population that has been told that they were the victims, but at the same time have differently integrated those ideas of Western superiority, just like everywhere else and in the Western world. It would be, I think, a lot easier for those conversations to be had as well if that complexity was always recognized, articulated in the rest of in people who live in English majority parts of the country. Obviously, it's not, and it's not also for a very specific reason. It serves a purpose not to understand that properly. The purpose that it serves is that, for example, if you're going to ignore that history of inequality between the two settler colonial states, then it allows you basically to legitimize the idea that basically British hegemony or English Canadian hegemony should be basically finished, and in that, or as a project, it should basically it's an unfinished project that deserves to be finished. Like Quebec is just being difficult by being different, and that French Canadians are just being difficult by insisting on being different. And so that is also a discourse that's being developed and is told over and again, as well as the idea that basically, which is an idea that's grounded in colonial violence, but that is incredibly mainstream, and so many people will say that without understanding the violence that behind it. That's basically saying that winners won, and that you need to accept that this is how history works. And so that kind of discourse is always is put as well forward to be able to counter Quebec nationalism, but obviously as well indigenous discourses and discourses that's coming from Black communities around Canada and other racialized folks as well. Ce que je viens d'articuler là, très rapidement, je suis consciente que je l'ai fait très rapidement, ça mène à très concrètement à des conflits ou à des façons de vivre certaines polémiques, certains enjeux de politique publique avec un décalage ou avec des incompréhensions ou des incompréhensions mutuelles ou des frustrations par rapport à ce qui est compris d'un côté ou de l'autre, ou de l'autre, ou de l'autre. And I'm just going to give some examples of that. For example, last summer or last spring and then last summer, when unmarked graves were the headlines around the country, I know this, and many others know this, that there was initially a very big gap in terms of the coverage and the emotions in the public around the idea of the Indigenous children being just dying and being killed en masse across the country for decades. And obviously this is something that people would have known before if they had read the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and actually paid attention to what people had been saying during those testimonials. But at the same time, the news cycle at that time in Canadian history was, which is just last year, really, I think, opened or changed the perspective of a lot of people on those issues who had not had an opportunity or the interest to learn more about Indigenous indigenous and Canadian state relationships and what that entailed in terms of colonial violence. And it took a while for those stories to hit home here in Montreal, for the reasons of, most of the graves that were discovered were out west, so there's a geographical distance, but there's also a widespread perception still at the time that basically residential schools were an English thing, were a British thing, and that French Canadians didn't do that, didn't participate in that. And as a columnist, I had the opportunity to write about how false that is. I was certainly not the first one to articulate that, but I'm just saying that it was really interesting to see the reactions to just seeing that all basically 50% of residential schools in this country, more than half of residential schools in this country were operated by oblates that are based in Montreal and were recruiting French Canadian nuns from the St. Lawrence River, and that many of the people who were operating the day-to-day who were in residential schools doing giving those awful treatments to the children. It was definitely a French Canadian story as well, given the history, the importance of the Catholic school in French Canadian history. And that came as a bit of a shock, and there was a lot of denial at first when that aspect of the story started to be covered. It took a while for it to be covered, and there was also a lot of violent rejection of just the basic facts that both main settler colonial groups participated in implementing and operating residential schools. So then again, it makes it very difficult for survivors who have French as their main colonial language to be able to express themselves, tell their stories, if they are so themselves are caught with this question that is sometimes unarticulated, but a lot of the time also asked point blank in terms of, yeah, but is Quebec also bad? Because that's what a lot of media want to know about as well when we're discussing this issue. So it's creating an uneven discourse around that, and it's once again about the idea of fighting for who actually was the bad guy in Canadian history, rather than seeing how the system operates, within Canada, with distribution basically around all settler colonial groups, but also just around the Western world, so that it's not, as I was saying earlier, only just a Canadian story as well. Another moment in which exactly what I'm discussing also came up just this fall was around, obviously, the debate around Bill 21 and the way in which it came up in the English language debate during the last federal election, and how the question that was asked by one of the journalists or the moderator at the time to Yves-François Blanchet just became this story that we spoke about for days, in terms of what does it mean to accuse Quebec of racism and all of that. And this was a moment that was really frustrating for people who are obviously Muslim, but also people who are racialized and are really concerned around by Bill 21 who actually live in Quebec, because once again it's catching catching people between a rock and a hard place, where people are trying to say that Bill 21 is something that they'd like to see repelled because this does not represent the kind of society that they want to live in, and it's oppressing mostly Muslim women based on what they wear. But instead of doing that, they also had to spend a lot of energy saying that they're not saying that because of receiving foreign funds from other Canadian politicians. That it's not because Quebec is part of Canada that Bill 21 is not acceptable. It's just not acceptable because it's not acceptable. And obviously there's a lot of racialized folks in the rest of the country who developed that discourse as well of you know, Bill 21 is not a Canadian value, and that's the basis on which they wanna they articulate their position to the bill, which obviously creates a lot in Quebec, a lot of opposition in parts of Quebec, and makes it very difficult, even more difficult for hijabi women living in Quebec who might be either losing their jobs, which are more generally, I think the issue is a lot more around more subtle job discrimination, employers being very careful about in all fields, and being more and more careful since that bill has been implemented about hiring hijabi women in visible roles. So the ways in which we're not hearing each other and we're not taking in consideration all of those dynamics just make the conversation on repealing Bill 21 and building real solidarities around those issues just more difficult as well. Another example that I could use very quickly is, you know, because the two examples that I just gave on Margraves and Bill 21 were things that were very explosive in the news, but there's also ways in which this issue of language is coming into conversations around racial justice that are not necessarily as explosive, but that's still very much undercurrent of how things are being discussed. For example, I'm seeing more and more people being critical of official bilingualism in the public service in Ottawa, saying that official bilingualism is put in place to stop people of color from obtaining jobs, and especially senior jobs in Ottawa, which is a really interesting argument because not speaking French has never stopped privileged white men from dominating several departments. And there was just actually an inquiry that was published on foreign affairs being basically dominated by English only white people as a department. And but that discourse is put there, and people are obviously concerned about lack of opportunity of employment opportunity, equal opportunity. So basically the discourse is developed. At the same time, it's developed as in a perspective of acknowledging the very real reality that bilingual education is often a privilege in this country, and that people who are coming from more working class background in Ontario, in Alberta, in Saskatchewan, don't necessarily have the same opportunities to go into French immersion and whatnot, and then access those jobs. And so it's articulated as a racial justice issue in the GTA, in other places. At the same time, completely ignoring the fact that there are a lot of also Black folks from the eastern part of Montreal or other Quebec City that don't speak English at all, and that if you're gonna basically make French even less present in Ottawa, you're trying to advance your cause by removing opportunities for Black folks who are Francophone. And actually the vast majority of French speakers in the world are in Africa. Therefore, you know, that issue of the French language very much overlaps with issues of Black rights in Canada. There's way higher proportion of Black people in Canada that speak French than the average proportion of Canadians. And so it's incredibly tricky. And once again, because people are not necessarily hearing each other or even being sensitive to the reality of one another, people are not, you know, one of the key organizing principles in racial organizing should be that we're leaving no one behind. But those conversations on official bilingualism and whatnot tend to be articulated in a way that certain groups want to advance their own, basically their own, or fight their own oppression by actually making worse the oppression of other people in their same group that just happened to have been colonized by a different set of people and have therefore a different language as their first official language. So that is also one of the very frustrating ways in which I'm seeing this debate come up. And I could give many, many more examples, and maybe I'll get to do that in the question period. But I just wanted to end quickly on a couple of ideas. First of all, on all the examples that I gave, what comes out for me is a couple of different things. First of all, is that it's really hard to not, I was talking about systemic racism, for example, the way that it plays out, and that people are arguing over which is the best settler colonial society model. That makes me feel like there's this hockey game going on between the Habs and the Maple Leaf, and people like myself are the puck. We're not even players. We're just basically there's a competition between two models in Canada, and treatment of racialized folks and Indigenous folks and Black folks are basically argument points that are used to score, basically to prove that you have the better social model, or you have the moral high ground, which is obviously a way to reproduce the very idea of white supremacy, which is about civilizational superiority. So it's a c'est un serpent qui se mord la queue. It's a vicious circle. The other thing that's very real that comes out of everything I just explained is exhaustion. It's very tiring to have to think of all those different dimensions when you're trying to advocate for racial justice and for social justice. It makes basically it doubles the work in terms of, it's not just that you need to advocate for social justice in 2 languages. If you want to move the national conversation, that you need to develop 2 different discourses, or 3 or 4 different discourses, because French speaking communities outside of Quebec are not French communities in Quebec that are not English Montreal, that are not Alberta, that is not. So there's so many different publics that you need to think about. And while you do that, while you think about all of those publics, you're not thinking about actually what you want to say and what you're fighting for. So basically, there's always a risk when you do anti-racism work to be centering whiteness and white feeling, but it's just that risk is increased when you have to talk about that diversity of settler colonial society. Makes it even more likely that you're going to be centering those affects, those feelings, those narratives in the way in which you're trying to advocate for your own liberation. It makes the dialogue around people who actually share an experience of oppression, more difficult. As I was saying earlier, because the dialogue is more difficult, sometimes building solidarity networks is also more difficult. There's a lot of people who will self-select out of certain conversations by being afraid of saying the wrong thing, or not having had a diverse enough experience of different locations around Canada to be able to speak to the national conversation. And so there's people who select themselves out, or are not confident enough to participate in the conversation, given how complex it is, how given that duality. And then there's because that duality is not even articulated like that, as I'm trying to do it today very often, there is not even necessarily recognition that this is an issue, and that therefore there's a need to be learning more about that and understanding more how that works in our movements. So I hesitate basically between giving 2 different kind of conclusions to what I'm saying. On one hand, I want to really stress the idea that I was saying earlier, that Canada is not special in the sense that, as I was saying, like the reactionary discourse, les façons dont dont le déni des systèmes d'oppression s'articule n'est absolument pas unique, ni au Québec ni au Canada, qui est partagé partout en Occident. Et comme je le disais plus tôt, le réflexe, la volonté de déni précède la façon spécifique dont le déni s'articule. Donc, il y a une partie de moi qui a tendance à ne pas vouloir, je ne sais pas si le bon mot, c'est pas trop vouloir prendre au sérieux, mais disons avoir un recul par rapport à ces différents appareils rhétoriques en disant justement, en fait, oui, la raison pour laquelle on ne veut pas reconnaître l'ampleur des problèmes ni y travailler varie d'une géographie à l'autre, mais en même temps, il faut plutôt s'attaquer au déni même et au refus de changer plutôt que la spécificité du discours, parce que le discours est un peu, dépend du contexte, mais est aussi un prétexte. Justement parce qu'on voit qu'en France aussi, il est là, au Royaume-Uni aussi, il est là, aux Pays-Bas aussi, il est là, en Espagne aussi, il est là. Les gens ont seulement des façons différentes d'avoir du déni, mais le déni est présent partout. Donc, il y a une partie de moi qui me dit, est-ce qu'on s'inquiète un peu trop de la façon spécifique dont le déni s'articule? Est-ce qu'on perd pas un peu trop d'énergie à répondre spécifiquement aux façons dont le déni s'articule? Donc, il y a une partie de moi qui est là-dedans. Mais en même temps, il y a aussi une autre partie de moi qui sait très bien que lorsqu'on prend le temps de faire ce travail-là, de contrecarrer ou de contrecarrer les récits nationaux qui empêchent d'avoir des conversations sur le colonialisme, le racisme systémique et tout le tralala. En ce moment-là, ça permet aussi d'élargir les cercles de solidarité, parce que de ce dont je parle en ce moment, beaucoup plus que de langue, c'est au fond l'idée de nos récits personnels et de nos récits collectifs. Et que donc prendre le temps de répondre à ce qui ne fonctionne pas dans les récits collectifs, pour beaucoup de personnes, ça vaut la peine de le faire, ça fait évoluer les mentalités. D'ailleurs, depuis 5-6 ans, il y a eu plusieurs personnes pour qui les mentalités ont évolué aussi. Donc, je voulais simplement terminer là-dessus, puis vous dire que finalement, entre ces deux axes-là, il y a de la part de vérité dans les deux. Donc, fait qu'il faut reconnaître la part des deux, la part des choses, et aller de l'avant, je pense, avec tant une conscience du fait que les tentatives de déni sont universelles, et d'autre part, prendre le temps de regarder comment ça s'articule spécifiquement au Canada dans cette dualité. Et puis, je dirais qu'il y a vraiment un besoin que je vois avec cette réalité-là, tant vécue que théorisée, de prendre la place, le temps de théoriser aussi mieux le rôle de la langue et de cette dualité d'origine coloniale dans le Canada, dans la façon dont ça a une influence sur nos mouvements sociaux. Si on ne prend que nos théories de la justice sociale au niveau des grandes universités, soit américaines ou occidentales, sans regarder ce qui se passe spécifiquement au Canada pour contribuer à la conversation théorique. Je pense qu'on ne va pas arriver à articuler vraiment ce qui se passe précisément chez nous, et donc les meilleures façons aussi de contrer les discours oppressifs dominants. Donc, merci beaucoup. Là-dessus, je vous laisse la place pour la période de questions.